Hello everybody, I'm George from Ireland. So welcome back to my channel. Carrying on speaking about Donald Trump's maladministration, which he's seeking to resurrect, seeking to come back in 2024. So let's look at his staff. Now, over half the Trump appointees had resigned or been sacked by 2020, and that's by far the highest turnover in history. So it's go-go record breakers, and well, indeed go-go promise breakers in Trump's case. So Trump certainly has a zest for strife, because all was fret and confusion in his maladministration. He hired more lobbyists than any other president. His appointments were of more of white males than of any other cabinet since the 80s. So the president showed this marked tendency to appoint people of anti-Enlightenment views, and that obviously plays well in the Bible Belt. And I don't think anyone under Obama or, say, Bill Clinton was anti-Enlightenment. So in 2017, he fired the FBI director, James Comey. Trump's minions were out to state spurious reasons for Comey's dismissal. In an interview, Trump said it was because of the Russia investigation, which is exactly the opposite of what Trump's toadies have been out saying in the media. Trump himself blurted it out because some of what she says is confessional, though he will tell the most blatant lies all the time. Sometimes the truth accidentally slips out. He's sometimes caught telling the truth. And Trump even asked Comey who he voted for. Comey is a Republican. Now, I don't know if he voted for Trump in 2016. He might not have voted at all. Anyway, but that wasn't good enough, Comey being a registered Republican. They had to be personally loyal to him because, of course, Trump's not loyal to the Republican Party at all. It's merely a vehicle for his self-aggrandizement. Remember, Trump was a registered Democrat for years, was a Clinton donor. If the Clintons are the root of all evil, Trump must also be evil because he's a facilitator. Okay, so it obviously reflects just as bad on the Clintons that they were willing to pal around with someone so utterly sick and morally bankrupt as Trump. Anyway, President Trump repeatedly asked Comey and others in the Federal Bureau of Investigation to say in public that he was not under investigation. Comey and his subordinates declined to do so, and I would say that's obviously affirmative silence. By saying nothing, that's saying, yes, you are being investigated. So Donald J., he surrounded himself with military men, though curiously not military women. Perhaps he thought some of the respectability of the top brass would rub off on him. You know, you can judge someone by the company he keeps. He craved recognition as a hard man. The president then said in public he could have risen to the pinnacle of the military if he'd enlisted, but he's so utterly bereft of the virtuosities that make a good soldier, airman, marine, that's hard to imagine. I'm completely unmilitary. Trump is ill-disciplined, totally dishonorable, slothful, corpulent, ungallant, physically cowardly, a caitiff in the moral sense as well. And anyway, he's miles gloriosus. It was just an utterly risible claim. I don't know how that didn't stick in the craw of military people. Anyway, so Trump put a former Marine officer in as his chief of staff, and this chap was supposed to bring some order to this uniquely unruly administration. But the president was the worst disruptor. The chief of staff did not manage to rein in the administration. Because Trump's sometimes hyperactive, they're also torpid, and it was a sclerotic administration. Trump's midnight Twitter storms exacerbated the chaos and dysfunction which characterized his maladministration. Suggests he's obviously insomniac. Someone with these such irregular sleep patterns tend to have a deeply disordered mind. Now, one of the few successes Trump had was in dominating the media cycle. He drove the media cycle like no other president, which obviously underscores what he's really about, is simply craving publicity. He's an attention addict. So he boasted being energetic. I mean, he's energetic only with the digits of his notoriously undersized paws. Say what you like about Trump, and noisome, unholy fool would be apt, but he's not dull. He is newsworthy. He's always making a splash with his incessant, outrageous insults, flagrant falsehoods, and so forth. They caught media attention He had to be reported. He was the president. You couldn't ignore him. He was consequential. And what he said had an impact. Yeah, it tarnished America's image worldwide. But that was something which deserved to be reported. It was impossible to ignore Trump. He patently believes, as Oscar Wilde said, that the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about. If he couldn't be famous, he'd be notorious. So he kept his name in the headlines day after day. And if all publicity is good publicity, well, Trump was on to something there. Now, he was in the headlines even more than is usual for an American president. Well, let's come on to impeachment, because Trump's the fourth ever American president to be impeached. The House votes to impeach him. It's at a simple majority. It goes to a trial in the United States Senate, and the Senate voted on that. Now, the Democrats needed a two-thirds vote to remove him from office. That's never been accomplished. They doubted they had the two-thirds, but they felt that they had to take a stand against his rampant criminality. And the key issue here was military aid to the Ukraine, and making that contingent on the country announcing it had opened investigation into Hunter Biden, who's the son of Joe Biden, who at that stage was the putative Democratic candidate and is obviously now president. So Trump insisted the Ukrainian government tell the press there was an investigation to Hunter Biden, because that would be electorally advantageous for Trump. It would divert attention from investigations into Trump. So they wanted to start a hair about this Burisma thing. Biden was front runner to be the Democrats' nominee at the time. So Hunter Biden used to work for a Ukrainian gas company called Burisma. It had been under investigation for 2 years prior to Hunter being hired by the company. The Trump team then pretended that Hunter Biden himself was under investigation when it was the company he worked for and not him as an individual, nothing to do with him, and it long predated Hunter Biden even applying for a job there. So the Trump administration cooperated with the Kremlin to propagate this specious and ludicrous claim that it was Ukraine and not Russia that hacked the 2016 election. No one has ever claimed the Ukrainians have ever interfered in any election anywhere in the world, whereas the Russian Federation has persistently done so. So indeed has the United States. Hillary Clinton was an outspoken advocate of military aid to Ukraine. Now, why would Kiev want to lose, given that she was four square behind them? It was a claim so staggeringly stupid, only the Republican base could swallow it. It required utter ignorance of Ukrainian affairs, but okay, a lot of people abroad don't know anything about Ukraine. The enormous of Trump's abuse of office was unprecedented, and the Democrats felt compelled to act, however unlikely it was that they'd win. Remember, Lyndon Baines Johnson said the first rule of politics is you have to be able to count. The Democrats knew they didn't have a majority in the US Senate, and they stood almost no chance of removing him. Remember, impeachment requires a two-thirds majority to depose the commander-in-chief. You don't want to make it too easy, otherwise you'd be changing presidents every week. The Republicans were utterly unprincipled in their allegiance to the president, in spite of his numerous felonies and transgressions. There was a very slender chance that half the Republicans would be so stricken by a sudden attack of conscience and moral decency, they would feel compelled to uphold the Constitution and boot Trump out. It appeared to be a forlorn hope, but the Democrats believed themselves to be duty-bound to at least attempt to boot out this ever-recalcitrant president. They had to try. If they did not do so, then posterity would weigh them in the balance and find them wanting. Future presidents would know that they would have an untrammeled ability to misuse their office for personal gain in both the pecuniary and the electoral sense. There would be no distinction between the commonweal and partisan advantage. So a line in the sand had to be drawn this far and no further. You have crossed that line, you've done something utterly outrageous, and you have to go. Actions have consequences. The Democrats had to at least attempt to do it. They owed it to their conscience as well as to the public. But Trump was the most impeachable president in both senses, and Republicans are so moralistic. And these self-appointed guardians of the Constitution should presumably hold one of their own to the highest possible standard. But that's a curious thing, the double standards, that really there is no standard, there is no bottom line, there is nothing he won't get away with. He's really immune from any moral standard. So the Democrats are reason-driven. Time was that the GOP was also part of the reality-based community. But these guardians of ethics and constitutionalism would forgive Trump anything despite his total lack of contrition. The impeachment process proved that bipartisanship is old hat. And obviously, don't forget that the Republicans wanted to remove Bill Clinton 20 years earlier over oral sex. Well, actually, perjury about that, which I know lying under oath is bad. And I, at the time, actually thought Bill Clinton should go. Maybe I was being too pharisaical about that. Anyway, in a theophrastic statement, Adam Schiff adumbrated the case for the president's deposition from office. So Senator Schiff, he delivered his oration in this euphonious baritone, carried off with splendid panache. The evidence was beyond the realm of doubt. Despite a mountain of irrefutable evidence, the Republicans would not budge. The evidentiary basis for the charges was seldom disputed by Republican senators. The evidence they heard was the probative basis for Trump's removal being a constitutional imperative. By stark contrast, the Trump administration riposted with accusations against Biden that were without foundation. No Republican could rebut the case against Trump with any aplomb. They just bleated about this being a conspiracy against their kingpin and blah, blah, blah. It was just hot air from them. So in the end, the vote was along almost entirely partisan lines. Mitt Romney was the only Republican with a shred of decency. He, of course, was the Republican candidate for the presidency in 2012. He cast a vote against Trump, but most Republicans voted not to hear or even read most of the evidence. They had wanted to depose Bill Clinton for lying about a blowjob, remember? But when it came to betraying an American ally in time of war, they weren't even willing to consider the case against him. What about audium alterum partem? You go ask here the other side. Etiam diabolus audiator, one of the core principles of natural justice. So when it came to high treason, they wanted to keep the president in office. That's Wednesbury irrationality. So after the acquittal, the president fired many officials who had not towed the party line. He went on to muse about his desire to break the Constitution and serve a third term. Only 2 terms allowed by the Constitution. Okay, you could have a constitutional amendment to change that, but he didn't even talk about doing that. It never occurred to him to seek to do this through the constitutional route. He wanted to rule by fiat. L'état, c'est Trump. Well, that is the way he would have it. That's enough from me, so please follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and so on. And thank you so much for donations at PayPal. It's georgecallahan79@gmail.com. That's me on PayPal. Goodbye.